GPS, as it says here, stands for Global Positioning System. And as everyone is probably aware of, we had navigators for a long, long time. Our mariners went out 500 years ago and they were able to get from point A to point B. When airplanes came along, we found that we ended up with some pretty good navigators there. And so the Air Force had a good system, the Navy had a good system, the Army had a good system. They hit everything perfectly. But somebody like the Secretary of Defense says, why can't we have one system? So back in 1973, which happens, well, missile years, that's back a little ways. So the Joint Program Office, he said, would be formed, and you guys go get it done. And the Air Force was directed to be the executive service, and still is after 50-some years of running this. My math isn't quite correct. It would be 37 plus 1. 27 plus 1. How about 48 years? We're there. But after 48 years, that's a long time. And we're still in charge. We still have the program office in Los Angeles, although now with the new Space Command, we're getting very close for them to take over at least portions of this. So that's where we are. So some 48 years ago. So we'll look at, start a little bit with yesterday, which was 48 years ago, where we are today, and then where we're likely to be tomorrow. Now this organization chart, and I'm going to hit 4 areas on this. One, the composition of the program office, and I have a separate slide on that. And then we're going to talk 3 portions of GPS: the satellite control system, the space systems, and the user equipment. So we'll break this chart down in 4 ways. Didn't expect you to absorb it all at once. Okay, program office composition. This chart was from 1984. I happened to be in the program office from 1976, shortly after it started, the 1984 years. During that time, the Air Force didn't want the system, the Navy didn't want the system, the Defense Mapping Agency didn't want the system, the Marines didn't want the system, no one wanted the system. So we're supposed to go create a system. We didn't have one of these little things yet. We didn't have satellites up, so we didn't need this. We didn't have a control system, but we were told to go put a navigation system together that everyone could use. So consequently, we ran into funding problems all the time. As soon as we got started on one thing, the Navy would be a little short some places, so they'd say, hey, we're pulling out a GPS. And then so a lot of cages would get rattled, and the Navy would come up with some money, or the Air Force would give them some that time. But we went through it every year. That was the biggest problem, is funding. And no one wanted it, so why are you guys working so hard on a system that no one wants? Well, as you see there, the Air Force had 150 people. Army, Navy had about a dozen each. Marines had a few. Defense Mapping Agency. And one of the real stalwarts in the whole thing was NATO. We had representatives from 7 NATO countries, but they were our very best guys from those countries. And so we integrated their engineers in with all the other engineers. We moved forward. So as you can see, in this case, we had 190 guys. That's just the military people, basically. So now that I just said what, and these were basically all handpicked. I guess that's the phrase we still use, handpicked. That's how I got the job. No one else would take it, so I was handpicked. Okay, here's the gentleman that led the program, Brad Parkinson. And Brad was a graduate of the Naval Academy. And when he entered service, he came in as into the Air Force. He wanted the Air Force. And he did a lot of good jobs, very bright guy. And one of the things they did and told Brad to do was go over in Vietnam and start figuring out how we can drop fewer bombs but more active bombs. So Brad was up on the 130 gunships, everything else that he could be on, and that was, they said, okay, you got it. So then the next job he had was assigned to the Air Force Academy. But guess what? He had his own detachment at the Air Force Academy to start working on GPS. And then later the Secretary of Defense said, hey, pull them all together and all of you do the job. So anyhow, this is Brad. He's, at that time, he was about, not that time, he's about a year or two older than me, made full colonel in year 15. And he was one of the greatest guys I've ever seen. He would go in a room with 40, or I remember the one time because I counted him, I was in a room, 41 top scientists in the United States. And everyone was trying to shoot him down. And Brad took them on one at a time. And when they all got done, usually Brad got his way. But he developed a few enemies because someone would tell him why the system wouldn't work, which you didn't have yet. And then the Navy would kind of huddle, and the Marines would huddle, and the Army would huddle, all trying to be against Brad and gang up on him. But it's just amazing what he could go through. And I'll show another picture of him in just a moment, tell the other little story about him. Okay, the mission of our program office, which was GPS at the time, was drop 5 bombs in the same hole and build a cheap set that navigates, and don't you forget it. And that was our mission. Cheap set that navigates and be able to drop 5 bombs in the same hole. And this just picture I got from Don Crosley 5 years ago in Las Vegas. I think it wasn't Don. Yeah. Don says, hey, did you ever see this picture? I says, I can remember it, but I never saw it. So this was in front of his GPS magazine. And I'll bring these people a little more into focus. I happen to be the second one from your right over there. And I'll bring them in a little bit later. But in this particular one, guy number 2 and 3 going that way, they both became major generals. And Don ended up taking over from Brad Parkinson, where Brad basically got fired because he told some scientists how to do the job when they said, no, you can't do it that way, it's not possible. Okay, so you'll see these guys a little bit later, and I'll speak for them on your questions. Now here's Brad just 3 years ago at about age 78. And he hasn't changed too much, but everyone is basically still against Brad because they want to sue him for doing this, that, and the next thing because GPS is putting their guys out of a job, whoever it might be, and because of the efficiency. And I'll get into some of that a little bit later. Now, on that big busy chart that I showed you, one of the segments is the space segment. And if you want to ask any questions as we go along, I'll answer it, but I'll answer it short because each one of these programs are really big. And the space segment, to get the GPS as we all envisioned it and worked at it, the U.S. is committed to maintaining availability of at least 24 satellites 95% of the time. That's 24 satellites because you have to have a constellation and it's worldwide coverage. Satellites flying in a medium Earth orbit of 12,550 miles. So they're a ways up there, and each satellite circles the Earth 2 times a day. That's
How many satellites?
Next chart, please. Here's the current constellation, and this chart's a little busy, but I'll try and bring it into focus. As of January, we had 31 operational satellites, and for the full constellation to be very, very effective, you need 24. And as you can see, some of them, our early satellites, we got none of those operational. Those were ones that were launched about 20 years ago. But we keep them on orbit because there's still enough information coming from them if we need them. If suddenly we should lose 2 or 3 in a different place, we'd move some of these in, and the atomic clock's working, and they can still send signals. It's just not as good. And the going from your left to right, we got 8 operational that were put up in the early 2000s, and they were supposed to last for about 7 years, and they're still working, some of them 15 years later. And then we bought the satellites in blocks. So like this block here happens to have 15 in it, one by from Lockheed Martin for 15 satellites. And 4 of them were up as of 3 months ago, and then we're launching each one when we get them available. Now, putting together a satellite and launching it, we're not like some of Elon Musk right now where he sends up 1,000 and has them spinning up there all over. These satellites run about $300 million a copy. And so when we get them up there, we want them to stay up there. And so along with that, and of course each time you send new satellites up, they have more capability, more users. Everyone's always clamoring for a user, and I'll show you in a few minutes one of the reasons why. And to track all these satellites, we also have to develop a control system. So we got people that are monitoring these 24 hours a day, and we got the monitoring sites and antennas, etc. And this chart's a little busy, but that's how much of the world where we've got various satellites, the various control systems and monitoring, etc. Because we have to know exactly where every one of those satellites are, because they're sending out signals all the time, and we have to make sure they're in the correct orbit. And as you can see, Schriever Air Force Base right near Colorado Springs is our main control center right now for controlling the satellites. But can you imagine the satellites at 12,500 miles circling the Earth twice a day? And you want to know what each one is doing and why. And if it's got a problem, do I have to take it out of service and put another one in its place? And they're all synchronized. So now after I mentioned the 300 billion a copy, give or take a little bit, who pays for it? Well, Mr. Taxpayer pays for this service. Bulk of the program is funded through the Department of Defense. And the core program, as of last year, cost us 1.8 million. I'll correct the million, to billion, 1.8 billion just for the normal maintenance costs each year. And if somebody wants a special GPS receiver in some form or whatever, then that's an additional cost, and usually whoever has come up with why they need it will fund it. And guess what? You got another argument. What if 2 guys want it? One says, I got $1, the other guy, he says, but Sam over there has $10. You know. Okay, GPS today. There's several views that the number of satellites that are out there and the uses of the GPS exceeds that of the internet. And the internet is as effective as it is because they use GPS timing. We have the atomic clocks up there, two minimum on each satellite. That's made it basically, no individual company or person or whatever needs a timer, because they got, all they have to do is use GPS. And this number of receivers hovers around 5 billion. And 5 billion with, this is count 1. And if you look around in your house and think about it a little bit, think how many you have. And I know in our family, when I said, I wonder how many do you have? I came up with 5. Because I got one, in 2 cars I got the receiver, we got 2 handsets, and then essentially the modem in our, for our internet is a receiver. So we got 5. So pretty soon you start looking, and remember, this is a worldwide system. So, and to back up just a little bit, this is one of the first ones we ever built up there on the street. And that was our trial balloon, so to speak. And I know Paul Weber very well, and he's a pretty big guy. And that little, we called it a man pack, and initially weighs 30 pounds. So I think we minimized it a little bit from that 30 pounds down to this. So, but that's what we started with. We had to have something that said, if we got the signal up there now, how can we gather it and use it? And today, GPS remains the world's only global utility, and it is free except for American taxpayers, I guess. Now, we can use all of it we want because it's broadcasting all over. We can handle 5 billion receivers, as an example, because it's a radio signal that goes up from that satellite. And the satellite signal, many times, when it leaves from 12,500 miles, when it gets down to the receiver, we're only picking up 1/1000th of the original signal that when it left the satellite. But it's good enough. Our receivers can pick it up, rejigger it, and use it. And again, we can say it's the world's only global navigation system. And I'll put a but in here. But the Chinese have one, the Russians have one, and other countries have one. Nothing matches ours. And basically what they do is they put a couple satellites up, GPS type, that you can use as GPS, and use our satellites to augment theirs. But ours is the only system. And whether they'll ever catch up with us, we're trying to stay ahead of it. The reason GPS has lasted all this time is no one wants to get cut off from using GPS. It's a word called control. Okay, GPS accuracy. Normally, we can operate with 3 satellites, and when we first started 40 years ago, we had to get 3 satellites up before we could know what kind of signal we were getting down to that man pack you saw there, and then start using it. And then we can, a 4th satellite resolves the timing, and a 5th satellite, if you go into a real robust system, now this is where somebody wants something like for earthquakes, or movement of glaciers, or anything where you need real precise timing, you can add a 5th satellite to your collection, and then the 6th one that can automatically detect and fix any of the problems. So what we're doing is monitoring it. We have so automatic that all we have to do is monitor the system if it recognizes a problem. And this measurements to less than an inch, it's actually much less than that. I had a friend who subsequently died, was using them for taking IEDs, explosive devices along the roadsides, and picking them up in places like in Yemen, some areas just full of it. And he says they could use GPS down to about a millimeter for detecting how to go pick up that IED there. And so any measurement you want today is pretty accurate. And I'll add a little bit to this a little bit later. How is GPS adapted to civilian use? Remember I said the program office's model was to put 5 bombs in a single hole? Well, back in the early 80s, when we had 3 satellites up, Defense Mapping Agency started using the satellites. And they found that their mapping costs almost disappeared because they now had accuracy. You know, you could go down a highway sometimes, as you're going along, it suddenly takes a right for a little bit, and then you go straight again. Well, they almost had it right, but with GPS they could get it accurate. Another thing that we found out is that, especially for us missileers, where we had a target, when you really look at the accuracy, we didn't have the right target. We weren't close enough. So if we wanted to put 5 bombs in that hole, it might have been the wrong target because the world is not mapped that well. So then you have to start out and map the world also, so you have some real close idea of where the target is. So for years we were bombing each other, not even knowing where the target was. And then when the Persian Gulf War came up in 1991, we had GPS became a household word. One of the reasons it became a household word is most of the mothers and wives and everything started sending these type receivers over to the troops so they'd have accuracy, know where they actually were in the Persian Gulf area, and they could do much more accurate whatever we were doing to clear in the area. So and then in Desert Storm, we realized that commercial receivers we were using much more than military receivers. And I'll explain that in shortly. Vast number of potential users. Suddenly we started marching towards that 5 billion number. And then also we set up a commission to start pulling all this stuff together. But this is now like almost 30 years after the original GPS was set up. So where are we today? GPS reaches us as a whisper. We give it a voice, and if you listen closely, it will tell you the story of the world today. Just like right now, every one of us sitting in here with GPS, somebody knows where we are. And if you don't believe it, all you have to do is click on it, and it'll tell you where you are. Okay, now getting back to the user equipment with it, which is the 4th group of that subchart I wanted to bring into effect. Again, now the satellites provide service to both civilian and military users. And for many years, the first 30 years of GPS, or I should say 20 years, we had to have 2 codes on board, one for military use and one for civilian use. And President Clinton said, hey, let's quit that, or let's just send out one signal. And before it was called selective availability. He said, I don't want to hear it about selective availability anymore, just send out one signal. And that made all the systems much easier to set up and program, where you didn't have to have whether you were 10 meters or 1 meter apart, so that's really helped. Now, again, the system's available on a continuous worldwide basis for virtually everyone if they have a receiver. And I'm going to go through several of the applications. Probably one of the biggest applications, and one of the reasons we haven't heard so much about the food shortage in the world, is precision farming. A farmer can now go down a row and they use the example quite frequently of sugar beets. But when you're plowing a row of sugar beets, if you get too close to the sugar beets, that's it. That's the end of it. If you're plowing too far away from it, you're not doing any good. But they found that if you can go down and plow within an inch of where that sugar beet's growing, you get a big crop of sugar beets. And not only that, it'll tell you where you need the water, where you need the fertilizer, and everything else. And so precision farming is very accurate, and it's used all over. And Don Crosley, did you want to add one or two words to that?
No, sir.
Okay. That's an Iowa farmer, okay? Okay, in meteorology now, in a thunderstorm, you got a lot of water vapor going up in that thunderstorm, and you see it pop at the top. We can take GPS, look at that thunderstorm, determine how much water vapor is in the thunderstorm, and then determine how big a downdraft we're going to have, like we had here the other night. So if that's what you're looking for, you can do it. So that's just one of the examples. Aviation, it's pretty nice to know that that plane you see coming at you is going to stay at the right altitude, etc. It's taken quite a while to break through the aviation area, and the FAA has been in and out of that, and they finally decided after 40-some years that maybe we ought to pay more attention to this. And now there's a real correlation between what the FAA has and GPS, and they're working together. And that's where each has been able to keep their own systems going, but they meld them together and they got a hack system. And I put an et cetera in here. How about environment? We're able to measure how deserts are moving forward in this global warming, if there is such a thing. Marines, you can imagine all the boats and ships and everything that goes along with it. The rail, a number of my buddies, when they retired from the Air Force, went into railroads. And can you imagine knowing where every boxcar is on your line, like the Great Northern or something like that? So it used to be they'd lose boxcars because they'd put them on one of those sidings, and the engineers railroad engineers didn't care about losing the boxcars and such. But if you're trying to run a railroad, it's kind of nice knowing where your stock is and whether it's loaded or unloaded. So that's another example. And public safety, we can also figure out where crowds are gathering and everything else with GPS. If that's what we want to do. Roads and highways, you hear about a lot of these bridges that got cracks in them and that. Well, GPS picks a lot of those up right now. And so if you focus on a bridge, you can tell how much movement you're getting out of it and whether there might be something wrong with it. Space, we just recently landed a spacecraft on Mars, and we landed it properly. And we landed that spacecraft using GPS with a reverse. They used the Earth as a measurement to get to the spacecraft and how it could land on Mars safely. And the survey mapping, I mentioned that. Timing, I mentioned that. Earthquakes, they're getting very good at prediction on earthquakes. And they're not giving you 2 days notice. I mean, it's still in minutes or maybe the small parts of an hour, but they're getting much closer on it. They can tell when these plates are moving and get it right now. And most of you are doing it for recreation and disasters, not hurricanes, etc. And one of our big items is 5 bombs in the same hole yet. And I was talking to the B-1 captain out on the flight line the other day, and I asked him the question. I says, "Can you still put 5 bombs in the same hole?" He says, "We don't worry about putting 5 bombs in the same hole." And I said, "Why?" He says, "Because we dropped 2 bombs now, And they're so accurate, when the first bomb hits, we have the second one, that when all the debris goes up, the second one comes in just when all the debris is going up in the air. So if you're trying to penetrate further down into the earth, you can with the second one much easier because the other is just flying up in the air. So that was my answer, the 5 bombs in the hole, but it was great. Okay, timing accuracy, I've kind of mentioned that a couple times, but we can now measure time within 100 billionth of a second. And as I mentioned, each satellite has 2 GPS atomic clocks on it. And I can remember when we had to go invent those clocks. GPS concerns. GPS, you hear it spoken about all the time. In fact, most of you probably didn't even know what GPS stood for, other than the fact that if you needed to go someplace, you use GPS. So it seems like they're easy to use, but then think about what's going on. Virtually every military system we have now uses GPS in one form or another. So if we change anything on those satellites, or if whatever tank or whatever wants to change something, then we have to figure out both the acquirer of GPS signals and the satellite to make sure we're still in sync on everything. So every time we go to make the change, it's a lot of work in any form. And so that is a real concern as it's evolving. And the DoD has been working for decades to develop jam-resistant capability. And then I found it very interesting that the Department of Homeland Security now publishes a book on how to protect yourself from some GPS spoofing, somebody else getting that signal into our little cell phone, etc. So that's just shows you how far this has come now. And one little go back on those 10 or 12 items I mentioned to you. What you really have going there is there's a bureaucracy behind almost every one of those words. And the number of people who work in that bureaucracy might be between 10 or 20 or 30,000 people for each one of those little words. And I'm going to give you a little clue here in a minute. So, now that you know a little bit more about your cell phone, go out and enjoy it. There's the most beautiful website, gps.gov. And you go in there, and there will be pages and pages on each one of these various areas. And you don't have to go read those books that I was reading. And then I said one day, why don't you go in there and look on the website? And I was absolutely amazed. And it's up to date, currently up to date. And back to these guys. The guy on your left is Mel Birdbaum, who was the main guy that pulled things together for the program. And he had a brain that wouldn't stop. Don Henderson took over from Brad Parkinson as the second program manager on GPS. And then we had Ralph Torino, who was our monies guy. Myself as the procurement guy. And when we used to go out for bids and we would advertise it, we'd get about 100 different companies that came in and said, hey, I want to build a GPS receiver. And my job was to run those bidding conferences and eventually select one or two or a number or more to work on the projects. And then Joe, our Navy guy here, he was excellent at using user equipment and developing it. So if you want to ask any of these guys a question, I can maybe answer it.
Ken, you got a question?
Yes.
What about these private companies like Garmin? Do they have to pay anything for the use of the GPS system?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
And maybe they originally won a contract with the government, in this case, probably the GPS program office. But if they want to go develop their own receiver, they can, and sell it to you for whatever. But that's a big business. That's how we got $5 billion right now.
Did the NRO get involved early or late?
Well, I happen to work, the question is, when did the NRO get involved in this? It's, NRO stands for National Reconnaissance Organization. And for me, I just happened to leave GPS and I worked for the NRO for 6 years. So, good enough answer.
Yep.
Any other questions? Next, Dan.
What's the next step, Ken, in the development of GPS? More satellites, more,
We probably do not need more satellites. We're making them better each time we put one up. But the signal it covers the earth all over now. And remember, our original one was 95% of the time. We've been doing 100% for quite a while. But you need more satellites. You need a few spares so something doesn't glitch. You know. But we've been very fortunate in that the environment the satellites have been in, they've been able to operate much longer than we thought. So we're getting up to 15 years with some of these satellites. Yeah.
What are our adversaries doing to capitalize and use this system?
Well, I hope we keep the development like we are, but they can't ever quite catch us yet. So that's the main reason they're working it, and they wish they were as fast as we are. And there's also big costs. So they're trying to say, why am I trying to develop my own system when I can use the U.S. system and get almost the same results?
Other question, are they in fact using our system?
Yes. Yep. And we're agreeing with, we're putting this out for the world.
So that's kind of our best defense is their dependency on our system.
Correct. Why do you want to use your allowance money on something that you could get for half the price or a quarter of the price?
Do we have the capability to monitor theirs?
They're pretty much intertwined, yeah. But that's another world that I don't know that much about. Okay, any others? Yeah, well.
I got a local farmer, and he's a big farmer in my neighborhood. He uses planted soybeans and corn.
Yeah. Willa says he's got a farmer in his neighborhood and he's using GPS to plant his corn and what else?
Soybeans.
Yeah. If there's a farmer, a big farmer that doesn't embrace GPS, he's probably not a big farmer much longer because he can't compete with the big farmer that's using GPS. The more that we use GPS and the less the farmer touches it, the more efficient the product is.
The no-till, they put in the grass killer, come out about a month after that planted. Next time they come back, the harvest time. Don't touch that field in the trees.
Yeah. That's great. And, yeah.
Yeah, considering we have some great future thinkers, and we're gonna move into space, and maybe Mars is the next thing we're gonna move to, are the forward thinkers thinking about, hey, we need to set up a system like GPS around Mars?
I can't answer that very well, other than the one example I just gave you. We used GPS in a reverse mode to be able to land our spacecraft there just a month ago. And that says what we're thinking about it. We really thought about it to be able to use the Earth as a data point and send the signals back and forth. So I think the answer to that question is yes, but I haven't really seen where there's a product coming out of that yet. And maybe it's still in the back room.
Those satellites, do they eventually decay in orbit and fall back to Earth, or?
At the present time, we're not taking them back to Earth. We could. Because generally they're
So are they all still up there in orbit?
Most of them are. And they're still usable under some circumstances. We don't call them operational satellites, but there's some parts of it that we could use sending signals out that would help us if we lost a couple. And I'll ask one of the questions. How come somebody doesn't just shoot these satellites down? Well, they're up there at 12,500 miles and they're circling the Earth twice a day. Well, where are you going to catch them? Okay, if that's it, that's it.